Hello, this is MCC Brussels, and welcome to another deep dive. My name is John O'Brien, the head of communications, and I want to talk to you today about a report that we published in November of 2023. The report was called The Silent War on Farming. Now, you don't have to have lived under a rock to actually appreciate in the last couple of years, farming has been front and center of conversations in the European Union. Why? You might have seen farmers' protests. You might have seen that it's been part of a conversation about the Green Deal. Today, I'm joined by Richard Schenk. Richard is a researcher with MCC Brussels, and Richard is the author of this report. Welcome and thanks for coming in to talk to us today, Richard.
Thanks for having me.
How did EU agricultural policy start out where it did with the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP? Started out with Never Hungry Again, and seemed to go off the rails.
The EU is an incredibly slow-moving machine, so we have to go far back in time to trace down the origins of EU agricultural policy to 1945, to the end of the Second World War and the establishment of the order after the war. And for European nations, it was a key experience coming out of two world wars. That both times there were blockades, there were food shortages, and millions of people actually died because of this food shortages, and they were dependent on outside forces exporting their food to them. So everybody agreed on that they need strategic autonomy. This buzzword that is nowadays out there was invented already back then, and this strategic autonomy meant that they established a common market for agricultural goods and production in Europe. They heavily subsidized farming, and they wanted to increase output. And to increase output, what they did was not simple subsidies, but they channeled subsidies into amalgamations, into specialization of farming, and also into technological innovations. And this led to an enormous increase of food production across Europe. This was the most successful episode of European agricultural policy, because actually this goal was achieved, and by the 1980s we have had butter mountains and milk lakes. So if we had overproduction as an issue, but not anymore at all food shortages.
Mm-hmm. So could these butter mountains, and I remember the butter mountains, I remember the wine lakes.
Yeah.
Could they be seen as an indicator of success? Why were they seen at the time as being something to be embarrassed about or a failure in the system?
Depends on how you measure success. As I said, the goal of this common agricultural policy was to produce more food. In this regard, it succeeded very well. Obviously, if you apply measurements like how efficiently were tax euros used, or back then not euros, then it was inefficient policy. And also it was a policy that worked very well in the specific setting of the Cold War, as I explained. So when after 1990s, when this scenario was no longer the case, then it became the issue: how do we how do we transform this Cold War policy into something new?
So that's where I think Agenda 2000 came in, and really the beginning of agricultural regulation, and particularly environmental regulation in agriculture. Is that where the genesis of this is?
This was the first explosion of environmental regulations, because in the 1990s, there were several reforms like Agenda 2000, where the targets were shifted. The EU technocrats called it multi-conditionality of agriculture policy. They wanted to achieve food security, but also environmental targets. They wanted to have economic efficiency. They wanted to develop rural areas through agriculture policy. And this new targets in the agriculture policy led to a dilution of the original core. And many mechanisms that are today so dominant in European agricultural policy, like the so-called cross-conditionality, when you get only subsidies if you fulfill environmental targets also, they were laid down in the Agenda 2000.
Emission trading schemes?
No, back then, not yet. Climate change was not an issue as today. Environmental protection was, if you think back in the 1980s, it was about, at least in Germany, it was about sour rains, about the ozone layer. It was also about many environmental issues that were very important, to be honest, like the increasing water quality, increasing air quality. These were all measures that were in their infancy back then, and in the first steps that were taken were very reasonable ones, and were also very successful.
Well, that's one of the things that I think confuses a lot of people, because most reasonable people actually do care about our environment. If you like, hiking, if you like being out in nature, if you like cycling, you know that the environment matters, and we know that it's important that we pay attention to the environment and practice well. But something's happened. How come the EU developed such a one-sided view of the environment that seems to bash farmers? Like, how come things developed policy-wise in this direction?
One particular event that was weakening the focus on food security and a lot was the expansion of the agriculture policies to the new member states in 2004 and 2007. It had an effect that was it was calculated with, but had different effects in the end, because the amount of subsidies that were provided to Western European farmers was pretty high. So the golden ages of EU subsidies are not now. They were back then in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. This was the level when, compared to the overall economy, the amount of EU agricultural subsidies was the highest. But it was clear for everyone that when expanding the system into the vast areas, huge land areas of the former Eastern Bloc, and also into agricultural sectors that were comparatively underdeveloped, this was not fiscally viable. So they step by step cut back the agricultural subsidies a lot in the 1990s and 2000s, so that the common agricultural policy could be expanded into the new member states. This led, obviously, that the other aims relatively gained more attention. Many of these Eastern European states, for example, now developed an agricultural sector that was the amount of subsidies was still larger for them than before, and they reacted to these new incentives. They said, okay, so the environmental cross-conditionality stuff is much more important, relatively speaking, in the Eastern states than in the Western ones, because they have reacted to this incentive and built up structures and agricultural schemes that are now dependent on this stuff. So, and this gave a momentum to even more shift towards the ecological goals, environmental goals, but also to the rural development goals.
Did environmental NGOs, did the environmental lobby play a role in the type of fixation that we see policy-wise with the environment, and with the environment above all else, above the interests of farmers? Is this the result of NGO lobbying?
Now we have reached the year 2010, so this was what new member states were the big issue in 2000s, now 2010, and now the climate climate emission-focused environmentalism is really gaining track, and now we also see that with this expansion of the powers of the European Union in the treaties, and of first Nizza, but then later Lisbon, especially in environmental areas, all these NGOs now see, okay, we have here a golden opportunity to implement climate policies at European level that are affecting agriculture. And already the new CAP periods in the 2010s, and especially after the 2019 election with the Ursula von der Leyen Commission and the Green Deal, have completely shifted the direction towards climate change. It actually became now unidimensional again, in the sense that now climate change is the overall goal, not for food security anymore, and only within this framework can food security be addressed. So, and this is the farm to fork strategy that is currently now in place.
Do you have a worry about our food security with the way things are going, with the way environmental regulation is driving the agenda in Europe in relation to agriculture? Is food security something that people listening to this podcast should be worried about?
The standard answer that you always hear about people who are defending the environmentalist approach is that food security and climate change are not mutually exclusive goals, but food security depends on doing something against climate change, on reducing emissions, on mitigating the impacts of climate change. Actually, these two goals, that reduction of emissions and climate change mitigation in the agricultural sector, they sound complementary to each other, but they're actually conflicting goals. Mm-hmm. Because if you want to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by in the agricultural sector, it's basically cutting back production, especially of animals and meat, mm-hmm. because in Europe the vast amount of greenhouse gas emissions comes from animals in the agricultural sector. The second part is forestry, but in both sectors it basically make it through different mechanisms and taxes and emission trading schemes, you're making meat more expensive to produce, so that the prices increase and people consume less meat.
So that brings us on to the two sort of case studies that you include in this excellent report. The first case study involved the rebellion by livestock farmers in the Netherlands or the Low Countries. Can you take us through what that rebellion was about and how it started and how it went?
We already mentioned that in the 1990s, the first environmentalist goals sneaked their way into the EU agriculture policy. And in the case of the Netherlands, this was the Habitats Directive and the Nitrogen Directive that were introduced in the early 1990s. This meant that all across the Netherlands, we had areas, Natura 2000 areas, that was especially protected for biodiversity reasons. And this made the Netherlands kind of a laboratory for the whole Europe. You had here a special case because the Netherlands is an extremely dense area regarding population, economy, but also agriculture. The Dutch are actually excellent in managing this different goals. They have a long tradition of mitigation of their effects, and you see a tulip field next to an industrial power plant and residential areas, and usually it worked very well. But now with this European framework, what became the issue that agriculture areas next to Natura 2000 areas increasingly became also had, so it was not about the area, Natura 2000 area itself, it was about the agricultural area next to it, because the nitrogen, both in the soil and also in the air, obviously does not know the boundary between this. This caused a specific problem because you also had a high density of animals in the Netherlands. So the Dutch government increasingly struggled in fulfilling the EU requirements for the Natura 2000 areas. And
is that the Dutch nitrogen crisis?
Yeah, this is the Dutch nitrogen crisis, because nitrogen is basically coming from proteins. Proteins are in animals. So animal husbandry became basically the most important, the hottest topic suddenly. Mm-hmm. And the Dutch government's solution to fulfill the EU requirements was to halve, this was the original goal by the mid-2010s, to halve the amount of animals in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. So obviously, if you were living from animal husbandry, but also if you were dependent, for example, on manure to fertilize your fields, this is had a huge impact on Dutch agriculture, and also agriculture is even more than agriculture itself. It's the core of identity for many Dutch rural areas. Just think of cheese, Dutch cheese. How many tourists are there? How the Dutch cuisine is built around this Dutch cheese a bit. Yeah.
So in Flanders, was this what happened in Flanders? You and I made a movie about Daisy and Gunter Klaasen, two poultry farmers in Flanders who are facing bankruptcy as a result of changing environmental regulations. It's a really tragic case, and viewers can watch that video on our YouTube channel. Is that what they were facing? These ever-changing nitrogen type of regulations that were crushing them? Because they started off, if I remember correctly, they started off being a green farm. Yeah. They started off getting all the certificates. The NGOs were saying they were great. Then overnight they went to be a red farm.
This is why I said that the Netherlands was like the laboratory for this new. They made the regulations for the Natura 2000 areas in EU law stricter and stricter with every period, which means that first it was the Netherlands that was affected. Then it was Flanders next to Netherlands with a similar structure. And if you think in the future, basically it will affect the whole European Union at one point. And what the people thought that this periods of legislation and regulation of next to the Natura 2000 areas, they can do it. They just need to invest more. They need to have new stables, new machinery, have to think about what to do with the manure, and then it's going to be fine, because actually farmers themselves love to do this kind of stuff. They love to invest, they love to think in the future, and they obviously are living from the very soil that is being polluted, so they want to have a sustainable solution. But what happened, that the regulations were now so strict that even with the best and most modern equipment, you couldn't fulfill them. So this is why the Dutch government solution was just to cut the production at all, because with the agriculture in the Low Countries is basically the most productive, most innovative agriculture in the entire world. Mm-hmm. So, and if they cannot fulfill these regulations with this equipment, nobody can.
Talking to Daisy and Gunter, reading your report, looking at Flanders, I sort of had a feeling that it's as though the environmental regulations are made to get rid of farming. Because if you keep on pushing the demands for less and less emissions, you reach a point that Daisy and Gunter have that they're going to be bankrupt, because it basically says you can't keep that many chickens. Their business model needs a certain number of chickens in order for them to make ends meet. Yeah. So am I deluded? Because I feel every time I look at these things that they're actually trying to put farmers out of business. Is that what's going on, or is that a non-intentional side effect of environmental extremism?
That is clouded behind a wall of studies and official document and impact assessments. But as I said, if you're over a goal of all EU policies right now is to reduce emissions to meet the 2050 targets, Europe fit for the climate neutrality. Then, and if you break down into this agricultural context, it's basically reducing meat production in Europe. And how do you do this? You increase the burden, you increase the price, and then the official documents usually stop. And then they say, they leave it open what happens next, but it's clear that on the ground, if people are going bankrupt, they face increasing burdens, they face regulation, they did not even get the license anymore, and then they are standing there with the stables in this Flanders case with a bank loan, and they just going bankrupt.
I did a deep dive with our colleague, the Italian journalist Thomas Fazi. And one of the things that we talked about was how these environmental regulations basically allow big farming, industrial farming, off the hook. Yeah. It's small farmers that these regulations really target and destroy. So one of the reasons why big farming doesn't turn up on demonstrations, it's groups of small under-resourced farmers that have been out protesting in Europe. Why would the environmental regulations favor big farming over small farms?
Alone the amount of bureaucracy is something that many family businesses, and 90% of farms in Europe or family businesses, are not able to stomach anymore. It's if it sounds nice that you have to live next to a Natura 2000 area, but then you have to document basically everything. When you cut the grass, when the cow is out there for grazing, how much manure has been produced, what have you fed to the animals, what kind of fertilizers did you use, how much, and this everything needs to be documented.
I imagine no farmers were involved in the production of these guidelines. Or big farmers, because obviously if you have 50 hectares and only your family is working for you, that's a different issue than if you have 5,000, even in some cases. Mm-hmm. And then because then you have an administration that's just doing the work for you. So this is compared to the overall production, your administrative burden goes down. You gain a comparative advantage compared to the small scale farmers who are going bankrupt, or they're with their banknotes and they need to sell. Mm-hmm. So this leads to already led to a new wave of amalgamations. Now, not because of specialization and efficiency gains, but because the small farmers are being driven out of business by bureaucracy. We have had please correct me, look in the report, but in the last decade, around 1/4 of all family businesses already went out of production in Europe. Yeah, that's right. One of the things I saw in the report was the whole second case study that you took up, which was the whole area of Finnish forests. Yeah. Can you talk us through a little bit what you found when you looked at forestry in Finland?
This is the other main field where this climate only approach has its consequences for European agriculture. We talked about emissions, mm-hmm. but now we are talking about carbon sinks, because the forestry is the only area in agriculture, mostly, that is able to remove carbon from the air. Mm-hmm. And how do you achieve this? Basically, you don't cut the tree. So you have different technocratic mechanisms to achieve this. But what the EU wants to do that not only increase the overall amount of forest in Europe, but forestry as a business should be made less, should be transformed. This is the euphemism, into basically nature conservation areas, where you have, if you have a forest in Finland, previously you lived from selling wood and timber to the local sawmill. Now somehow you should be able to live from emission certificates or tourism and this kind of things, but no wood and timber should leave, which is basically carbon, should leave your forest anymore.
How do we have IKEA then? With no wood, you're not going to have furniture production. Mm-hmm. Do they worry about that at all?
That's something that is basically left open, and at this point, this is where this top-down approach that we have one overarching goal that should be implemented in whole Europe reaches its practical consequence. Like, okay, now we have broken down the climate target till the finished forest, and the consequences are completely unexpected, because what will happen that we will import wood from foreign sources. And we can already think of that where this is going to happen. Mm-hmm. Think of the rainforests, of the boreal woodlands of northern Canada. These are the resources where you can get wood from if we are not producing our own.
Crazy. Mm. Now, one of the great things in your report is that you came up with some serious policy recommendations. You came up with a sort of a strategy that could address some of these challenges that we face in Europe and some of the lunacy of the EU bureaucracy. Mm. Can you take us through some of those policy recommendations?
We need to seriously rethink this top-down approach, that we set a central goal all across Europe and then we break it down, and then we face consequences that we don't even reach the goal actually. So because in many cases, the assumption is that we reduce production and then people will consume less of the agricultural product, but most politicians are smart enough to not do this, that to actually remove stuff from people's plates, or not leave them enough timber to build their own homes. So we import this stuff, and usually the imported products are produced with a much larger carbon footprint than the domestic ones. So we are not even reaching this goal. So we should rethink this. If it comes down to climate change, the first thing that we should focus on is food security, and how do we achieve this by climate change mitigation for the European farmers, because the farmers worry about climate change. But what we do is that we force them to reduce emissions, which for the individual farmers has only negative consequences. So he, after a certain point, will not be able to, do not want to implement the current climate policies, rebels. This leads to farmers' protests, and then we are basically there with nothing. So we should focus on, when it comes down to climate change mitigation at the local level. We should also respect that European agriculture is extremely heterogeneous. The Dutch example is a good one. It is a very specific structure of agriculture, combination of industry, agriculture that is interdependent and cannot be steered from Brussels via bureaucratic decrees. The member states and also local communities should have the ability to do their own agricultural policy, again, without interference from Brussels, because they will do some adaptation to climate change for sure.
You talked about a new model. What do you mean by a new model?
The new model is this bottom-up approach. We should restructure our environmentalist policies, again, not from central planning to decentralized decision-making, because we have this long tradition of sustainability in Europe's regions out there. The people who live there, who have skin in the game, they know how to adapt to climate change, how to react to the new developments around them. And if we set do central planning from Brussels, we want to interfere with when they cut the grass, what they grow whatever.
So basically, free farming from the bureaucrats. That's what you're saying. Free
farming from the bureaucrats. In our research, when we were doing this, our farming-related work, we asked so many farmers, what are you more afraid of, bureaucracy or climate change? They said bureaucracy, because bureaucracy immediately had a negative effect on their daily life. And they said, dealing with weather and climate this is my expertise. I want to do this. I want to face the challenges. This is something I have control over, where I can rely on not only tradition, but also on my professionalism to deal with. I want to do this. But when it comes down to bureaucracy, this is like the worst kind of force of nature for me. This is completely unpredictable, has immediate negative consequences, and even endangers the sustainability of my farm. So we should really give farmers more leeway into how to.
The farmers' protests resulted in some minor concessions, and we're still unsure about where the whole Green Deal is at this point in time because of the recent confusion about the vote. Where do you see things at the moment? Are we in a place that things could change for the better, or is the cause of farming really a lost one?
We definitively can cut back excesses first. And this is what the Commission did. It took back some of the most unpopular measures that it has taken during the last years, and basically shifted the responsibility to member states to deal with this. But the very core is still unchanged, that we have this, as I told you, the top-down approach, that we want to roll out this centralized policies across all Europe. And I'm a bit afraid, because many member states, governments, and also farmers' organizations think, if we just get more money, it's going to be better. Yeah, it's going to be better first, but then you can think in the future, if the environmental restrictions are getting harder and harder with every period, you will need more money. But the EU is certainly not swimming in money currently, and budget restrictions will always
it's a tap that can be turned off.
It's a tap that can be turned off very easily, very easily. And also, which farm is going to profit from this? The farmers with the best lobby in Brussels.
Mm-hmm. Richard Schenk, thank you very much for joining us today. You and MCC Brussels really saw the crisis in farming before it hit the headlines, before the farmers' protests. And if you want to read the report, you'll find it in the notes section just underneath this video. And I'd suggest to you that you have a read of it. It can also be found on the MCC Brussels website. Thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to welcoming you again to another Deep Dive.